Welcome all. This is in lieu of our Thursday night session. I apologize for the recording rather than the collaborate session, but a few things came up again for the last minute. So hopefully you can review this at some point over the weekend. No rush. So just a couple things I will talk about the article critique assignment here. I will present the rubric, which of course is also available through Blackboard, and I'll go through the PowerPoint presentations covering the textbook information. But I also wanted to throw, of course, a little extra epidemiological theory in here, and one of this is ideas is the combination of epidemiology and anthropology. Extremely important uh, idea here behind this interdisciplinary cooperation. And when they've done this in the past, we've seen, of course, really important advancements in science with the advent of biochemistry and then quantum mechanics, of course, and then sociobiology. I'm not going to read through all this. Feel free to pause this and read it on your own. But basically, the idea here is that, as we've seen, a lot of diseases are the direct result of lifestyle choices and culture and socioeconomics. So this is where anthropology comes in because anthropologists study the evolution, the behavior, and the culture of different populations. So these are really great complementary sciences that they can work together with. So um, again, feel free to read through that on your own. The idea of epidemiology, epi meaning on, and then I think it's dermis, I think that's correct, meaning people. And it's the idea of the diseases that are on people or affecting people. So, and of course, anthropology is the study of humans and their evolution and culture. So, these are great companion sciences. A big part of anthropology, especially looking at the past, is understanding what happens to a particular culture, especially if they were struck down by a particular type of disease. So this whole field of medical anthropology, and if I ever manage to strike it rich at some point, and I have a free will to go back to college, this is what I'm going to get my degree in. It's really a fascinating subject. So again, feel free to pause this and read through this on your own. I'm not going to do the whole thing, but just some of the different topics that they talk about. Obviously, population health, and as it relates to culture, and particularly local interpretations of bodily processes. So, if you consider the Chinese medicine approach or the medical approaches from India or other parts of Asia or Africa or South America, this indigenous culture, they all have very different ideas of some of the things, the ways that the body works, and the way that physiology works, and some of these practices, actually are effective. They studied acupuncture pretty extensively, and even Harvard Medical School is offering classes in it now. So, and of course, all these other things are very much related to epidemiology and things that we've been studying at. But just again, really, really fascinating topic. So, I encourage you to read a little bit more about it, or if you feel free to ask me some additional questions, and then that kind of led me to this next quick presentation. So again, a lot of my students are athletes, student athletes, so I kind of wanted to throw this in there. And this was the direct result of a question that my son asked me, which was, why do people play sports? Like, what's the whole point? And I just started to kind of BS my way through an answer. And it turns out part of my answer, at least, was probably at least partially correct. Um, this was in our DNA, this need to compete, this drive to compete, because for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, or whatever it was, we were hunter gatherers, and we had to compete. Competing meant that we were able to secure an area that we were able to get food from, harvest food from. So when neighboring tribes came too close, we would have to fight them, or in some cases, they wouldn't go to war, and they would agree on a competition between two people, usually two men, and the winner got the rights to whatever it was, whether it be a woman or a piece of land or whatever it was. So eventually, we kind of moved away from this idea of as we started to settle into. I'm sorry, let me go back to that. As we started to settle into agricultural societies, they think that we just started to do this more as fun than anything else. And then, really, in the past, since World War II, there's been this significant shift over to the business side of sport. And Ireland, I talk a lot about rugby. They didn't even really start doing professional rugby until maybe 20 years ago, at most. it was always an amateur sport, and now we're just getting much more into this idea of professional sports for whatever good or bad impact that has. But this is what I thought was really fascinating. Almost every culture across the world, even before we were globalized and were able to communicate with each other, every culture developed some type of a game played on a field approximately the size of a football field or soccer field, and it involved some kind of combination of kicking, throwing, tackling. And so I always thought that was kind of cool. Eventually, some of the smart ones, would use a stick and smack the ball with the stick. That turned into field hockey, or they would put a basket at the end of a stick and start flicking it around like lacrosse. So this idea, this drive for competition, again, probably goes back to the hunter gatherers, and they had a need to protect their territory. And that work was eventually kind of transformed into leisure activities, particularly for gaming and probably for gambling, of course, as well. Probably since civilizations formed, and probably even before that, people were gambling. But it's kind of funny. We have these images of these, tribal people, these tribal folks, and then we do the same thing. Well, not everybody, obviously, but the folks that are really interested in this, it's still very much a tribal mentality. Our tribe, our neighborhood, our whatever, our team, our local sports team is fighting your sports team for some silly little trophy or whatever it is, and it is a ritual. They go down every week and drink too much beer and eat too much sausage and jump around like silly people. But it's you look at these folks and then go back to the Aboriginal people here, and it's the costumes are kind of similar. So we have this need for conflict, we have this need for competition. It's in our DNA, and we have a need for physical activity, obviously. And our hunter-gatherer forefathers moved between 8 and 10 miles a day, and we need to still be doing the same thing, unfortunately. So check out this. This is just a real quick overview of the idea of anthropology of sport. So again, something that I quick explanation to my son that just got like in over my head because he just kept asking me more and more questions. Those of you that have children, I'm sure, can sympathize. Okay, sorry, enough silliness. The article critique assignment. Locate a case control, a cohort study, a cross-sectional study, a clinical trial, one of those, either in a journal, a medical journal, or any type of epidemiology journal. I would recommend that you use the St. Joe's Library website. I would suggest that you start off looking for one of those specific terms: case control or cohort, and then whatever you're interested in. If you're interested in a case control study and breast cancer, you could probably find something like that, or a cohort study and breast cancer, or a cross-sectional study, or and obesity combined with any of those terms, and I can almost guarantee that you'll find something that you can review. And what I want you to do is look through, obviously read through the whole article, and then go through and answer all of these. I think 15 or so questions. Okay, and I want these answered in order, please. It makes it a lot easier for me to read these when they're answered in order. If these are not broken out by this, it's a lot more difficult for me to ensure that you answered each and every question. So leave the question in here, leave a full paragraph or so, 2, 3, 4 sentences for each one of these. Again, this article critique example is uploaded into Blackboard, so feel free to go through this. Talk about the implications of the research. So for example, if you're doing breast cancer and you find that there's some type of dietary risk, what are the implications of that research? Well, you got to start telling people about that dietary risk, and what type of feedback are you going to get from that? If you tell people that they're not supposed to be drinking alcohol because it elevates your risk of breast cancer, you're probably going to get some pushback from the alcohol company. Who was the study sample? Who were the people that were actually looked at? And how did they recruit those folks? How did they get those folks to actually join into this study? What type of biases exist? I can talk about that a little bit more next week. We'll talk about the different types of bias. I think I did cover this briefly, but I'll go into it a little bit more detail next week. And of course, I'll post some additional information in next week's course materials as well. The research design of the study, of course, is either cohort study or case control study. What were the study methods used? How did they collect the data? Did they use surveys? Were they running blood tests or something like that? And then how was the data presented? If you don't really get the understand all the presentation data, don't worry too much about it. It can be really hard to go through all these statistics and really fully grasp it. And this is just an introductory course into this idea. So do the best you can with these answers, and then discuss the conclusion, and of course, what were the implications from that conclusion? Whatever it might be, and then of course, at the almost every study I've ever seen, at the end of it, during the discussion, the authors will self-identify limitations of the study. So just summarize those. Usually, every study has limitations. Usually, for financial reasons, they weren't able to do as much as they really wanted to do. Um, Again, we'll talk more about that. As far as the article critique rubric. Here you go. Just formatting. Make sure everything is answered in order. Make sure that the questions are there so I know which questions you're answering. Each question is answered thoroughly. I don't want one word or one sentence answers. Make sure that you identify all those key concepts. Um, Again, everything is organized, and make sure that, of course, we don't have too many issues with grammar at this level, thankfully. And let's take a look at chapter 11 and chapter 12, just real quick. Again, most of what I wanted to talk about with regards to epidemiology, we talked about already, but there is certainly some interesting information in here. They talk about the epidemiologists and biostats, which I took a semester of biostats in graduate school, and it can be you have to have a head for it. You have to have a real. I love math, and even that was a little bit too much for me. But of course, we've been talking about disease control all semester, and the epidemiological triad, of course, extremely important. This really goes more into the overall positions that are out there, which is not really like it is important. The whole thing with the SOCs, these things are important, obviously, preventing epidemics and the spread of disease, environmental hazards, preventing injuries. That's why I got involved in rugby, because I'm trying to minimize the concussion epidemic that is currently happening within high school or college sports and high school sports. Um, as far as promoting and encouraging healthy behaviors, that's more along the lines of like a health educator. So again, the epidemiologist is more like a research kind of person versus the public, more the public face type person that would be in health education. Somebody that has a little bit more marketing abilities versus the epidemiologist who just wants to be left alone with their data and their research tools, so that they monitor health status and diagnose health problems potentially, evaluating efficacy of different types of programs. Again, we're very much data driven. And media salary ranges. I don't know how accurate. I assume these are accurate. I shouldn't say that, but as far as the really good jobs for epidemiologists are in the pharmaceutical industry, and they make a very, very healthy salary. Um, of course, a lot of them have medical degrees as well on top of being epidemiologists. Um, Statisticians, there's actually a ton of money and excuse me, I shouldn't say that, a ton of jobs available for statisticians. You can go out on your own as a statistician and charge $50 an hour, and will have more than enough money. That's more than enough business. So they do pretty well for themselves. Anything with math is really good, especially the statistical software programs that they use now these days. Epidemiologists, some of those jobs aren't quite there, but again, what I was referring to, public health education and information, this is more the outreach, the community outreach programs, the community health workers. Again, these folks are going to have a little bit more, I shouldn't say this, but probably a little bit more interpersonal ability, a little bit more skill with helping people drive behavior change, things like that. So this is really, and this is cool too, and I love this kind of work. I do this a lot. I'm doing this more and more, trying to force myself out of the laboratory. Some of these jobs, it depends on. A lot of young people are very interested in this, It's very much an up and coming field. Hopefully, we'll get some uh, more and more funding from the government. Remember that article that I sent out to everybody from the Onion? That next the added step to the scientific method, increased funding. So or look for funding. So that's a big part of this. Preventing injuries, obviously, preventing epidemics. Going into workplaces and trying to help people understand how they can work better, eat better, prevent injuries. Ergonomics is really important. One thing that they're doing now is trying to minimize sedentary behavior in workplaces. So they're going in and they're setting up like standing desks, things like that, or telling people to set an alarm and once every hour get up and go up and down the stairs, just to get up and move. So there's all kinds of really cool things that these folks are doing, informing, educating, empowering people, mobilizing community partnerships. So again, if you remember from all the public health, or the way that the system is set up, is that most of the bulk of the work is supposed to happen at the local level, the community level, within the local health departments. The funding is made available from the federal level and it goes down to the local level, but it's up to folks like us with this desire and passion to really have a difference, to make a difference, to get out there and start doing these things. So, health educators, again, a little bit on the lower end for the salary. Again, it depends on what you do and where you're working and who you're working for. Uh, we'll see. Hopefully this, like I said, hopefully this field will really take off. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful. Again, I apologize for the last minute change of plans, but hopefully this will work a little bit easier for everybody else's schedule as well. Have a great Thanksgiving. Have a great holiday, and I will see you all next week. Feel free to email me with any questions. Take care.